So we are going to draw a relatively complex shape today that builds on our experience with simple geometric solids. And we're going to use some fractional thinking and shadow mapping and the shading techniques that we've been learning. So we're going to begin by making a vertical line. If you're serious about getting good at this, you really should be standing at your easel and putting your paper right next to your screen so that you can draw this what's called sight size. We want the drawing to be about the same size as the object appears on the screen. And I'm going to size the object to right here on the screen. And so you can see my drawing is about the same size as the drawing on the image on the screen. And the advantage of that is you can actually just carry over these landmarks and onto your drawing like this. Do you see what I'm doing? You can do the same thing on your paper. You can just carry over the heights, and that's going to guarantee that the proportions are correct. So if you're working at an easel, go ahead and bring those lines right across as best you can. If you're not sitting at an easel, you have to use a slightly different kind of thinking because you need to think fractionally. And if I'm thinking about this fractionally, I'm going to say, if this is my unit, then the overall height of this thing is about 4.5 units. No, about 4 units. This would be my second unit, third unit, and fourth unit. This is not quite exact, though. This distance from here to here is a little bit bigger than that distance. But let's go ahead and we're going to divide it roughly into quarters. Let's see. And now I'm going to erase the annotations so you can see my pencil lines better. The next thing we're going to consider is the relative height and width of this thing. And I'm going to say it's just a little bit wider than it is tall. So I'm going to mark the sides. I'm going to be going out. I want to build out the same amount from either side of my vertical axis and then sketch that shape. Okay. Let me, is that better? I'll draw a little darker to make sure it shows up. Okay. Okay, so we're going to use some more fractional thinking here. I'm going to measure this width. See what I'm doing? This width is, and I'm going to compare it to my height. And why don't you all try to measure, do what I'm doing, and try to hold your pencil out in front of you and measure that, the width of the neck compared to the height of the knob. And if you do that, you should see that it's about half. Another way to think of that, if you're having trouble grasping it, is if we made a square at the top of the neck, like that, there'd be room for about one more square getting to the top of the knob, like that. Okay, so this is about twice, this height is about twice the width of the neck. So we're going to use that to get the width of the neck correct, like that. If you can measure fractions and angles, you can draw literally anything. Most people just do not ever figure this out, and then they just think they're going to get better at it if they practice, and it's not that easy. So this is called a plumb line. I'm coming straight down from the outside edges here, and these are going to be construction lines that are going to help us find the other widths. Notice that we're going to do an S curve that comes out past this line and then bends around, and this is basically like a light bulb shape. And the tricky thing is to keep it symmetrical, like that. So I'm using two techniques here. One is fractionally thinking, like this distance here is about 3 times this distance. And the other way I'm thinking is by analogy, because I'm realizing that this shape looks vaguely like a light bulb, so that's going to help me draw it correctly. Now that I've found the outside of this curve, I'm going to bring that straight down. And we're going to notice that that's going to give us the width of the bottom curve as well. If you understand how wood turning works, that will be no surprise, because this is turned out of a block of wood, and so the widest points are probably going to be, that's as wide as the piece of wood was. And now comes the part that is going to be the hardest. We're going to try to draw this curve at the bottom. Make sure you make it round enough. And then this generally kind of comes in and then back out again like that. That's another S curve. And the tricky thing is to make this bottom part wide enough and to make these curves round enough. So having drawn the basic form, I'm going to erase everything except the outlines and then begin shadow mapping. And my form might not be perfect, but we're not going to make corrections yet. I'm going to show you when to make corrections. This is not the best time to analyze the form for accuracy. The best time is going to be after first shading. So I'm going to draw the shadow map in green so that you can see it easily. Notice that this is about a quarter of the way from the bottom of the knob. So I'm using a little fractional thinking to get started, and then I'm just going to draw the contour that I see, like that. It's similar to the shadow on a ball or an egg, but it's a little bit more angular because this is not a perfect sphere. This distance from here to here is about half as big as that distance was. So I'm going to make this a narrower space by about a half and then curve down like that. I'm just going to freehand this one like that. This one does something important. It comes over this ledge, goes down a little, and then out almost to the end. So those are all the shadows on the object. Last step is to shadow map on the ground. Notice that this form is an ellipse. Most of you are going to want to make this too round. It's very elliptical. And this is also basically another ellipse. And it would be really helpful probably to draw this line first. Because if we can place this line correctly, notice it's just a little bit below the apex of this curve. So it's right about here. If you're working sight size, you just have to continue it from the photograph. And that'll force us to keep this ellipse low enough. Most of you are going to want to put it way too high. So this is how we create the cast shadow on the ground. And following that, we're going to do first shading. I'm left-handed, so I'm going to slope my lines this way. If you're right-handed, just slope them the other way. And the goal is to just lay in a nice flat, even tone wherever the light cannot reach. We don't want it to be black, but we want it to be nice and even, not zebra stripes. And notice I don't stop when I get to the edge of the shape and start again over here. It's just one big, when you have two pieces of shadow next to each other, you just shade them all at once. And following that, we erase the shadow map. And at this point, you've tricked your brains. You created something your brains can see in 3 dimensions. And that ability to see what you've drawn in 3 dimensions is going to give you superpowers when it comes to correcting your drawing, because when it was all lines, it was really hard to see what might be wrong with it. But now that it's represented in tones, you should be able to make it better, because it's not going to look like, it's hard to see the errors in a line drawing. It's very easy to see the errors in a tonal drawing, because your brain's seeing it as a 3-dimensional object that might be slightly distorted somehow. I'm going to make a couple edits to my form. I want everyone to find, now that you're seeing it as a 3-dimensional object, I want everyone to just push and pull those shadow shapes until what you've drawn looks more like the thing we're trying to draw. And I don't care if you get it perfect. What I want everyone to do, though, is quickly glance back and forth between your drawing and the photograph and notice how easily the little differences stand out now that you've begun to shade. And the big lesson here is that it's never a good idea to try to get your outline drawing perfect before you've put some shadows in, because no matter how well you do, once you start shading, I guarantee you're going to start noticing errors that you were not noticing when it was just outlines, because outlines are very abstract and your brain has a hard time reading an outline drawing as a 3-dimensional form. Okay, we are going to proceed with second shading. You're going to have to kind of stick with whatever your outlines are now. And this is just like shading a sphere. Okay, we're going to be curving with the outside curve here, and then straightening out, and then curving the other direction when we get to this side. Notice the reflected light at the bottom of this form. So we're not darkening there, we're only darkening where the form approaches the light, like this. And then we want to sharpen this edge. This is a cast shadow, so we're going to shade with the edge. And notice that darkening this more is going to bring this reflected light out more. This is also a sharp edge, so I'm going to do some sharpening strokes around this corner, but I'm going to do it very lightly because I don't want to darken that reflected light. I just want to clean that up, make it a little bit sharper. And then I'm going to continue with these slightly rounded strokes coming this way through the cast shadow, curving with the neck of the form, and then sharpening this edge as well with vertical strokes. All our decisions about shading direction are aimed at either bringing out the direction the form is moving, like with these curves, or sharpening edges, as with this outside edge, or softening edges. And it becomes very natural with a little practice, but very, very few people figure this out on their own. You really have to be led through it a few times before it starts to feel natural. And if you can get through that, you're pretty much on your way to succeeding with the rest of the drawing, because you'll notice this form is very similar to this one. We're going to be doing curved strokes coming up into the light and softening this edge. Notice I'm never shading back and forth. I'm never doing this. I'm shading from the dark into the light and releasing my pencil with every stroke like this. And you'll notice there's a soft reflected light under the bottom of this light bulb form. Don't erase to bring that out. We bring that out by darkening where the reflected light ends, which is right through here. And that soft glow of reflected light underneath this form is what's going to make your drawing look round. Now, most beginners will see an edge like some of these cast shadow edges, like this edge here, and they'll think, oh, that's a really sharp edge. I need to really sharpen that. But let's just zoom in on it for a second. And I want you to notice the amount of softness that's in this edge, especially compared to this edge here. Can you see what we're looking at? We're looking at this edge here, which is razor sharp, and this edge here, which looks sharp at a distance, but it's actually comparatively soft. And our goal is that the drawing reflects those subtle variations in edges in the same way that the photograph does. Most beginners, as I'm saying, are going to over-sharpen this edge, and they're going to under-sharpen this edge. And this cast shadow edge continues. It goes over this little lip right here, and then it continues on to here. And it turns into a form shadow edge here, which is going to be softer. So we want to be able to show at least three degrees of softness to our edges. This edge is 0 softness. This edge is medium softness, and this edge is extreme softness. So when I assess these drawings, I'm going to be looking for your ability to represent at least those 3 amounts of softness in your edges. There's a strong reflected light right here because the object is coming so close to the ground. We're going to need to do some sharpening strokes under the form like this to sharpen that edge, and we can go as dark as we want under here. And then we're going to transition to horizontal strokes on the ground. Just get in the habit, if it's a flat surface on the ground, shade it with horizontal strokes like that. And a little more sharpening and darkening under here. Sharpening and darkening up here. And remember, our last step is always to try to show a little bit of the halftones. Optional, but the halftones are using much lighter pressure. There's a little halftone along this surface, along this surface. Basically all the forms that are vertical but not facing the sky. And a little halftone along this lip. Now this would seem to be an unusually boring thing to draw. But while you're finishing these drawings, I'm going to get rid of the photographs. You can look at my drawing, and I'm just going to demonstrate over here what we're doing this for. When we're dealing with symmetry and projecting forms and projecting curved forms with form shadows and cast shadows, we are dealing with a lot of the problems that are going to confront us when we draw and shade people. Most organic forms on the human body are simply a series of overlapping curves. So when we're drawing a face, I'm just going to draw the lower half of the face. We're going to be shadow mapping this knob-like form of the nose, putting a cast shadow underneath it, then shadow mapping the curved form of the upper lip, putting a cast shadow below it, the curved form of the bottom lip with a little cast shadow below that, and the curved form of the chin, which is going to cast a shadow onto the neck. And if you can shadow map all those forms, and do a first shading, and I'm not asking you to draw along with me here, I just want you to see the parallels to maybe make this knob drawing a little more meaningful to you. So first shading, and second shading, exactly like I shaded the knob. I'm going to be curving the forms of the nose, sharpening under it, and darkening the cast shadow. Leaving a slightly fuzzy boundary on the outside of that cast shadow. A core shadow along the top of the upper lip, followed by a sharper cast shadow under it. Core shadow on the bottom lip where it moves into the light. Cast shadow under it. Dark core shadow with a soft transition into the light on the chin. And sharpening with a cast shadow under it. And this is what most people get a little more excited about learning to do. But I want you to see that we're dealing here with exactly the same concept. We're dealing with overlapping curved forms and this repetition of core shadows, reflected light, cast shadow. Core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. Core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. Core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. And that's exactly what we have here. Core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. Core, reflected light, cast. Core, reflected light, cast. So that's what this is leading towards. If you can get to the point where drawing a sort of manufactured form like this feels pretty easy and simple, then you're going to be ready to do a really beautiful shaded drawing of something harder like a human face. So that's the end of the video.